Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about NATO invading classrooms. Our guest, Nolan Higdon, is a political analyst, author, host of the Disinfo Detox Podcast, lecturer at Merrill College and the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz, and a Project Censored Judge. Higdon's popular Substack includes the bi-weekly Gaslight Gazette, which chronicles important and well-researched examples of disinformation, character assassination, and censorship in the United States. Nolan Higdon, welcome to Talk World Radio.
Thank you so much for being here, man. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks for all that you're doing. I recently read an article you co-wrote called The Militarization and Weaponization of Media Literacy. Can you explain what's media literacy and what's its weaponization?
Yeah, media literacy is a long-standing educational practice dating back to early 20th century, but really around the late 20th century, there started to be a debate in the United States about what constituted media literacy, with some folks wanting media literacy to go in the direction of just kind of banal, objective analysis of media arguments. And there was the more critical folks who said, like, well, no, I think we need to have more of a discussion of like the influence of things like corporations on the classroom, particularly media corporations in the classroom when we talk about media. Basically, how are media corporations influencing the media education students are receiving? And, I was part of that divide. I've written a lot from the critical perspective, critiquing kind of the corporate influence on education, particularly media education. But there was a study that came out, or I guess a research piece that came out in 2022 from the Center for Media Literacy on a NATO scholarship that looked at basically what would a NATO media literacy look like and how could it be implemented and what goals could it achieve. And it was accompanied by these webinars. And I thought, a lot of the very same critiques I've had historically about corporate power in the classroom are right here, but it's military power. It's these big militaries from across the world that are part of NATO, and their corporate connections are certainly a part of that. Now they're trying to devise content for the classroom. And so Sydney Sullivan and I did a deep dive on the Center for Media Literacy piece. We watched the webinars, and we tried to use those to paint a picture of what it is exactly NATO is trying to do by getting into the classroom.
It's bizarre. I would hope some people would find it shocking. I mean, I understand NATO wants to continue to exist and there's not really an enemy and it needs to go into other fields. But why would schools or educational institutions or even governments turn to a military coalition, a weapons dealing organization to teach students about how to read or how to watch or how to understand the world? It just seems bizarre to me. What's the relevance?
Yeah, there's an interesting kind of history there, and I think the United States really thinks of itself leading the way, particularly when it comes to technology, and it does in a lot of ways. But when it came to things like cyber warfare or information warfare or cyber attacks, the United States was really caught off guard many times in the early 21st century. Obviously, 9/11 being one of the biggest examples of how the government didn't realize the power of the internet, right, to organize those attacks. But even during the Obama years, you had like attacks that were attributed to North Korea. And there were a lot of policy thinkers at the time saying the United States needs to focus more on the new war, the information war, digital landscapes, the ways in which people transfer information. And they were really trying to push within the Obama administration and later on the Trump and Biden administration to make that more of a focal point. Think of it kind of like looking at, warfare, like trench warfare becoming outdated, for example, by the late 20th century, right? They were sort of looking at America's militarism is outdated, not focusing on information warfare. And so I think this is part of that larger push. It's not just about controlling the information in terms of what people see and don't see or what they can do with it. It's also about training the next generation of how we think they should be using it. And I think it's very much more dogmatic in that way. And a group like NATO aligns well in terms of their interests with the power structures that control this country.
I mean, NATO makes videos and graphics and articles and webinars all the time, and it's all about how you need more weapons and less school and less healthcare and so forth. But what does that have to do again with media literacy? Like people need media literacy to interpret what's valuable and what's not in the stuff that NATO is churning out. But where does NATO get expertise in media literacy unless the idea is that the evil enemies, Vladimir Putin, has infiltrated your newspaper? Is NATO defending us from that, or what? How do they have expertise on this area at all?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it gets to a larger point, which is NATO, at least in the report and from the discourse we saw in the webinars, for the most part, there wasn't really any proof that these folks actually had knowledge of media literacy education. And just to pull out one kind of example in the weeds, right? Like the earliest media literacy was in the United States was during the 1930s, and it was all focused on protecting the public from, like Nazi propaganda or fascist propaganda. But once the United States entered World War II, there was a lot of pressure on those very same media literacy folks to drop that protection element. Because if you teach people to spot things like fallacies, they're going to spot it in US propaganda, and here we are at war. And media literacy researchers in the decades ahead realized, like, well, this protectionist approach doesn't really teach anything. It just kind of treats people like, non-autonomous vacuums, right? If we give them any information, they'll immediately believe it. If I put a, Mein Kampf in front of any person, they'll immediately become a Nazi if they read it, which is totally insane, right? People have the ability to critically think and reject. So, media literacy in the late 20th, early 21st century is not about teaching students what to think, but how to think. What's the process like? What questions to ask? Things like that. The NATO version is a return to the 1930s protectionism. They talk about known hostile actors or enemies of NATO's interest. That's all throughout that report. The ultimate goal is to teach students basically lists, almost like this McCarthyite sensibility. Here's who you should trust. Here's who you shouldn't trust. That's not education, though, as we all know.
Clearly not. It's not learning a skill. It's inhaling basic facts and trusting them, which is sort of the opposite of media literacy. I mean, who is getting this stuff? Is this getting into schools, into educational institutions? Who is encountering these teachings of NATO?
Yeah, this is why it kind of caught my attention because there's a lot of reasons why we don't have media literacy accessible across the curriculum in the United States. But one of the reasons simply is that it's really difficult to do professional trainings. So even though those of us who are passionate about it and have worked with nonprofits for decades, we can only reach maybe a couple hundred people on a good year who are teachers. But companies like Meta and Apple, Nickelodeon, they'll get resources in front of educators. In the case of like Meta, they'll do trainings with educators, or Microsoft will. They can reach thousands of educators in a weekend, where we might get hundreds in a year. Well, NATO's attached to a lot of those corporations. And a lot of corporations, have gotten involved in the media education space since the moral panic over fake news. And so I don't know a direct link between the NATO curriculum and teachers now, but I would wager that whatever findings are in this Center for Media Literacy Research on NATO are probably going to find their ways into the very hands of the people who are doing those trainings, because they run in small circles, they share a common interest. A lot of what they're saying is the same type of education. So I would wager that's probably where you'll see it appear. And then, of course, a lot of educators, they don't think about the corporate influence on education. So they may come across this study and think it's a great way to design curriculum for their classroom without asking those questions.
Is that sort of the reason that Meta or Google or some corporation would turn to NATO? I mean, is there some form of corruption involved, or is it simply that NATO is offering lots of stuff for free, and so it makes sense financially to take it? Or are they true believers in the goodness and mission of NATO? What attaches Meta or some other company to NATO?
It's really difficult to say, but I think sometimes when interests align, you can overlook ideological differences. We've seen big tech do this, repeatedly. When there's a liberal in the White House, they're all for engaging in censorship and fighting hate speech and promoting DEI. And then as soon as a conservative comes in, they flip a lid and say, "Yeah, it's not our job to be censoring information, and this DEI stuff's gotten out of control." They've always followed the profit. And so whether or not they agree with NATO's mission, I think is probably secondary to the industry. The question is, what's the benefits of, siding with NATO versus opposing them? And for a tech company, my God, there's a lot of benefits. NATO has global reach. It's proposing things like spreading NATO media literacy across the globe. If Meta could get a contract for that, that would, be huge, even if it was just securing some of the materials. So I think there's a lot of economic opportunity that might be more important to these companies than any sort of like ideological goal of NATO per se.
I, I don't understand why NATO is taking over everything. I mean, I was doing like the New York Times crossword puzzle the other day, and a question was about words in the NATO alphabet. Apparently, like if you say Frankfurt to mean F or something to mean G, it's the NATO alphabet. Like, why do they get their own alphabet? Why why do they get to educate anyone when they're a weapons dealing institution? And that global reach, is this push for NATO education happening in all NATO member countries, NATO partner countries? Is it particularly in the United States, or is this a global effort?
So the study and webinars make it very clear that they're taking a global lens to this. They think it's a global problem, this information war and that media literacy in these nations could be an anecdote, which I don't necessarily agree with the idea that we don't need media literacy across the globe. In fact, I totally agree with it. But again, that's why we did this study. The follow-up question needs to always be what type of media literacy? And so they're clearly advocating for it. It remains to be seen how this is going to work out in terms of the nuts and bolts of it. But look, again, NATO has a lot of influence. So if there are individuals or leaders who want to adopt NATO curriculum in their schools, I'm sure NATO would be more than happy to do that. And I'm sure there's a lot of countries that would be happy to adopt it to curry more favor with NATO and perhaps more powerful countries in themselves.
You talked about the decades of corporate influence in the field of media literacy and in education in general, and now this military influence. The corporate influence has been growing despite great efforts by yourself and many others to push back against that, right? I mean, it's just been growing and growing, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been growing increasingly over time. I think this is one of the kind of criticisms I have of a lot of liberals' take on what Donald Trump has done with education in his second term. I mean, no doubt about it, conservatives have targeted public education and the Department of Education for decades. It's been a goal dating back to Ronald Reagan to get rid of the DOE. But you can't tell that story without telling also the part that Democrats have played in that along the way. I mean, you can go back and look for the last 40 or 50 years, especially in Democrat states, like I live in California. How many corporate public education partnerships were there in these schools? How many pushes were there to change the way education is run more like a corporation? How much more power was given to management and more managers were brought in for this corporate style of education? And so, yeah, you do, end up with a generation of teachers coming in 20, 30 years later who went through that corporate school. They see education that way. They pass it on to the next generation. And the people who were there, before the complete corporate takeover, they're, really older faculty who are usually ignored and dismissed. And I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but it just anecdotally, that's what I've seen. And so that was kind of the state of higher ed when Trump walks in. I mean, it's already beat up, abused, and corporatized. And that's been, yeah, a problem in general, but of course in media education in particular, because a lot of these media companies saw media literacy as a way to get into the classroom, to get that attentive audience, to get access to their data, to hook them while they're young, as the tobacco industry used to say, and big tech now says. Those are age-old processes that are bipartisan, unfortunately.
It used to be, though, that I could read a newspaper or watch corporate television news and think what I wanted about it. Now I'm dealing with stuff coming in and stuff I'm putting out through these social media fora where if you say the wrong thing, it gets labeled. This is misinformation, or it gets, an explanation attached to it, or it gets a fact checker checking the facts and some other fact checker checking their facts. And what do you make of these? I mean, obviously, there are blatant lies, and it's probably useful to call them blatant lies, but what do you make of this new world in which some corporation is labeling stuff true and false?
Yeah, I think, that's been a massive problem, but I also think it's a symptom of a larger problem. We call it like the public square, or the de facto public square when we're on these social media platforms where they talk about building communities. None of that is true. All these technologies, whether it be the internet, touchscreen, GPS, they were all developed by public money and public research. We could have very easily taken those tools and geared them towards something that served, say, democracy or the public interest. Instead, we allowed them to be commercialized, and now a handful of corporations control the internet traffic, where most of the communication and commerce is taking place. And then, when we saw the problem with that, a lot of the moral panic fake news of 2016, say, or some of the market cornering of companies like Amazon, we really doubled down, right? When the fake news problem, a lot of lawmakers were like, "Well, let's not regulate, let's not expand media literacy education. Instead, let's pressure big tech to take fake news offline." And I think that was a huge mistake. It abdicated our democratic responsibility, and it put this into the hands of corporations. I think that was a huge problem. And to your point, I do this as for a living. Fact checking is needed. We do need to fact check, but fact checkers need to come from it from the perspective of what's true or false, or to tell a particular story. They don't need to be incentivized politically and economically to take things down. And that's the problem with corporate America, because we've seen them take things down not because it was fake, but because they were pressured by the powers that be in the White House to do so. Or they knew it was good PR to look like they were taking down a certain thing, even though it may not be false. Like those kinds of things are just anti-democratic. The radical idea of democracy is that we as humans, as autonomous individuals, can take in information and act on it responsibly. We don't need a corporate overlord, just like we don't need a government overlord.
We are speaking with Nolan Higdon, who is a political analyst, author, and host of the Disinfo Detox Podcast. Nolan, as a peace activist, I want governments to teach people unarmed civilian defense, how the skills to resist a foreign occupation. The problem is people can then resist abuse by their own government, and so no government wants to give people those skills. Similarly, you talk about the problem that a government is not going to want people to have the skills to incisively dissect propaganda and see through the lies of their own government, just because they have those same skills to see through the lies of some corporation, which, by the way, funds the government. And yet, we want media funded and controlled and produced for the public good, by a public enterprise, which you would think would be the government. There seems to be a big conflict here. Governments ought to be providing democratic media resources, but simply thrive on the ability to lie to people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these conflicts exist, and it's interesting that, like, in corporate media, this happens occasionally. I'll get interviewed and I'll bring up the need for public funding for journalism, and they'll say, "Aren't you worried, like, public funding from the government is going to basically be government media?" And I'm like, "Well, you get corporate funding. Does that mean you're influenced by corporations?" Of course they are, but they'll never admit that. So I see that seeming contradiction there. But what I would argue is we should think about, instead of a one size fits all, a kind of competitive model of diverse views. So don't totally get rid of corporate media in place of government media. Have them both. Also have independent media, have nonprofit media, have alternative media. Give people a much more diverse media diet. So, of course, yes, you're going to get government propaganda. I don't see that going away in my lifetime. Of course, you're going to get corporate propaganda and political propaganda. In a free society, you're not going to be able to protect yourself from that. But the goal is to keep lanes open for truth tellers to get their information out there, so truth seekers can have the information they need to participate in their democracy.
Are some people are doing better, I think, at media literacy. Is there progress, or as George W. Bush would say, is our children learning to see through the hype?
Yeah, he did, he did so well in education. He wanted to spread that to the country. Yeah, there's there's some advances being made. The thing about, remember earlier I mentioned that there's a quite a few factors why media literacy is not widespread in the United States. One of them is kind of a good thing. We don't have an education czar. There's not some education position that can wave a magic wand and force us all to teach anything, let alone media literacy. So it has to be done locally. The good news in that front, though, is, due to the moral panic over fake news and the rise of AI, I think a lot more school districts have started to take media literacy a little more seriously. A lot of the states have added language. I'll admit most of it's kind of toothless. It's still up to the kind of teacher to do the hard work to figure out how to get in the classroom. But some districts, particularly well-funded ones, they've made advancements. Some big districts have even required media literacy, such as like LA Unified. There's a lot of work being done in Massachusetts. And then, of course, these people never get credit, but I'm constantly in contact with teachers who are doing amazing stuff at, just the level on their own in their schools. So I think in that way there's progress, but I think we're far from that goal of where we can, confidently say that every person in this country has access to media literacy education.
Is LA or is Massachusetts a model that other localities or states could learn from and do better with?
I think so. A lot of it also, you have so many school district rules and teacher union rules, so it's a cluster. But like generally speaking, I think Massachusetts has done some pretty impressive stuff going to like the district level and doing trainings, and they do some incentives like professional development money for teachers, so teachers aren't spending this time not getting paid to learn this skill. So I think there's some things in there that could be useful, certainly.
If you were an educator and you were looking for who are the individuals or groups or organizations or the resources being used to do a good job in Massachusetts or somewhere else, like what should I be reading instead of NATO propaganda disguised as educational materials?
Well, I think there's a couple places. If you're really focused kind of more on news literacy, I think the go-to news literacy organization is Project Censored, who I'm affiliated with. If you're interested more in like kind of if you're in a district and you want to help kind of your district get media literacy, or if you're an educator who wants to bring it into your classroom and wants some professional development assistance, I would encourage you to check out Mass Media Lit. If you're a community member or just someone interested who wants to know about more about media literacy, I would really recommend the the Critical Media Project, which is at USC. And all three of those organizations have a lot of free stuff online. If you're interested in critical AI literacy, I've been doing a lot of work on that recently, and you can get it at my website, nolanhigdon.com, or my Substack, nolanhigdon.substack.com. And there's a lot of interesting resources there for critical AI literacy, and every organization I just named gives their stuff away for free to make sure that the public has access to it.
I hesitate to ask, what is critical AI literacy?
It's basically about, like kind of banal AI literacy is about just teaching students what AI is or isn't and how to use it. The critical approach is about looking at the power dynamics, who owns it, what are some of the threats, what are some of the ideological biases of AI, what's its impact on the environment, what's its impact on privacy and surveillance. So it's about teaching those students those kind of questions. So they not only come out kind of knowing what AI is, but they're also well aware of the problems associated with it. It helps demystify it. So they're not taking advice from big tech on what AI is and what they should do with it.
It's growing fast, right? People are not going to a library or a website. They're asking a robot what is the answer to this question, right?
Yeah, AI is being rapidly integrated into our society. I just had a call with my mother the other day. She said, "Why is AI on my phone? I didn't add it." And I said, "Well, if you did an update, Mom, it's going to add it." So it's getting added everywhere, whether or not people know it. But also, I have to say, I think a lot of people are rightly skeptical of AI, but they have behaved in, I think, a problematic way, which is they're just putting their head in the sand and not reading about it or learning about it. I think we need more voices out there to say, look, the AI is not intelligent. Nobody has ever said that. It is a product of the humans that created it. It has a ton of biases, shortcomings. It repeatedly gets things wrong. When it's pushed and tested to do things that humans can do, it fails. You can read a lot of Gary Smith's work on that I think is very pivotal and interesting. And there's some real dangers, particularly to our environment and our privacy with having AI run all these systems. And I would argue there's a big threat to our democracy as well. When we turn this over to a machine that's controlled by a handful of oligarchs to make critical decisions about our society or who gets healthcare or who gets resources, I think that's a bad place to go. So I would encourage everyone to have more discussions about AI and try not to avoid it. It's here, whether we like it or not.
Well, some people have called it intelligent because it's in the name of the thing. Intelligent. When I tell my younger son it's not intelligent, he says, "Oh, yes, it is." So I think the idea is getting out there. Uh, we've just got about a minute or two left. Nolan Higdon, what is Project Censored up to these days, and how can people get in touch with you or follow your work?
Yeah, Project Censored's doing a lot of really great things. In addition to the annual book and the radio show, they're also churning out a lot of amazing content on social media, these infographics and videos and shorts and reaching a much larger audience. So highly encourage people to follow them on social media and highly encourage folks to follow my work as well. I'm on all the social media platforms, although they're not social. But I also run a podcast, the Disinfo Detox. It's on all the podcast platforms and YouTube. Please like, follow, subscribe. It helps me a lot. And the big thing is I do a Substack, which is a newsletter that goes to people's emails. You can register for free. And I cover basically anything having to do with fake news, propaganda, media education. And I have a part of that is, in addition to articles, I publish a biweekly Gaslight Gazette, which every 2 weeks looks at prominent stories of fake news, character assassination, censorship from the 2 weeks previous. And that's at nolanhigdon.substack.com. Please follow me on there as well.
Terrific stuff. We will have some links up at talkworldradio.org. Keep NATO out of your mind, out of your brain, out of your skull. Nolan Higdon, thanks for the work you're doing and for coming on Talk World Radio.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your work. It's always a pleasure to be here.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.